I've had a couple moments in my life where it felt like everything was collapsing, where it felt like my reality was crumbling right before my eyes. Each time that this has happened, it's been because some new information has turned my reality upside down. The most recent time this happened was about 6 months ago. I was listening to the audio documentary by Annika Harris called Lights On. And in that documentary, she's interviewing expert scientists in metaphysics. And they were talking about the latest development in metaphysics and their new theory that space-time is actually not fundamental. In other words, space and time are basically an illusion. Now keep in mind, an illusion is something that is real, but it's just something that's not what it seems. In other words, the very fabric of our existence may not be what it seems. It is an illusion. When I was listening to this, when I heard this section where they really kind of came to a peak, a pinnacle of this argument, I was on a run, as always. And that's what running is. Running is an intentional dance through or with space and time. And when I heard this section and they made a very compelling argument for it, all of a sudden everything felt foreign. If I am not experiencing real reality, then what am I even doing? All of a sudden I felt tricked, deceived, weak, small, and just insignificant. After a few weeks, the initial ontological shock kind of wore off, and I began to ponder the utility of this newfound theory. If space and time are just a tool or a mechanism or a lens through which we experience reality, what does that mean? Does it change anything, and does this really even matter? And the answer is kind of no, not really. But that doesn't mean that understanding this new theory is useless. It doesn't mean that this new information wasn't worth learning. So from the way that I see it, space and time are what I'm going to call a useful illusion. Even if space and time are not fundamental or basically an illusion, that does not mean that they aren't practical and useful in everyday life. Space and time is the way that we navigate this reality. And there are other useful illusions like space and time. For example, money. Money is a socially agreed upon illusion. Money is not real. Think about it. The paper that we use as money has no intrinsic value. The only reason that it has value is because we agree that it does. Another big illusion are myths. Myths have been used for thousands of years to derive meaning. But we all know that a lot of the stories we tell in the books that we read, they're not real. But that doesn't mean that they don't have value. That doesn't mean that they aren't useful. And then the idea of the unchanging self that is inside of all of us. That is also an illusion. Nothing about us is the same as it was when we were 5 years old. Everything has changed. But it is psychologically useful to imagine that we have this unchanging self inside of us. That experience 6 months ago was definitely jarring. And eventually that ontological shock wore off, and I thought about the utility of it, and I kind of landed on this useful illusion idea. And then I was reading recently about Hinduism. I'm reading a book about the Bhagavad Gita, which is Hindu scripture. And in Hindu philosophy, there's this concept that we don't really experience reality. What we're experiencing is our nervous system experiencing reality through our five senses. And Hindu philosophy points to a reality that is deeper than what we experience. And I could not help but notice huge parallels between this ancient philosophy, thousands of years old, and modern metaphysics. The parallels were undeniable. And this idea of a higher reality or a different reality is not unique to Hinduism, but I loved how Hinduism called out the five senses, essentially saying that our five senses are useful, but they don't give us ultimate reality. In Hindu philosophy, the ultimate reality is Brahman, which is essentially God. And in this life, our five senses point us to an illusion that shows us a reality of multiplicity, division, and change. But ultimate reality lies below that. So after seeing this connection between ancient Hindu philosophy and modern metaphysics, it made me think about, what's the point of knowing this? Is this truly useful, or did I learn all of this essentially for nothing? If this won't change something in me, what's the point? And so the more I thought about it, the more I realized that once we realize that these things are just useful illusions, it doesn't make them disappear. It doesn't make the illusion go away. But what it does is it changes our relationship to that illusion. For example, money. Once you realize that money is an illusion, that doesn't mean that I'm going to stop going to work to get a paycheck to pay for things, but it makes it easier for me to not throw away my life for an illusion, for money. Same thing with this illusion of this unchanging self that we all have. Knowing that it's an illusion does not change the fact that I have a personality and a history and a character that develops over time. That doesn't change, but what changes is my relationship to my past self and to my future self. And it's the same thing with space and time. Just because space and time might be an illusion does not mean that I'm not going to lace up my running shoes and run through space and time every morning. All this does is change my perspective and my mindset. In Eastern wisdom traditions, there's this idea of the unknowing that comes after knowing. And this is different than ignorance. Ignorance is when you haven't seen. Unknowing is when you've seen clearly enough that you know that you cannot trust what you see, that you will no longer mistake the map for the territory. So what does this mean for running if space-time is in fact an illusion? For me, running is my way of saying yes to this layer of existence, to space and to time, and to a body that moves through both. The way that the rhythm of my feet in the morning on a run, the miles that I log every day, the way that my body moves through the morning air, none of this becomes less real because there might be something deeper. Running becomes this full-hearted participation in this layer of reality. And that's only possible because we can see through the illusion. And that, to me, is the unknowing that makes life more meaningful. It's not the ignorance of having never seen, it's the unknowing that comes after seeing and realizing that there are things that we may never see. And that's why I love running. Running goes hand in hand with the unknowing, because I don't run to know more. Running helps me remember how to stop knowing in the wrong way. And maybe that's what unknowing looks like. It looks like running through space and time, understanding that it is not fundamental reality, that it is basically an illusion, and yet we love running anyways. I don't know. I am far from an expert in this. I am way in the deep end with metaphysics and Hindu philosophy. This is just something that I thought was incredibly interesting. So I hope it was interesting for you, or at least thought-provoking in some way. And if it was, I hope you'll stick around, and I'll catch you in the next video.